Today on Recruiting Roundtable, we're discussing one of the most important topics for any talent acquisition leader, that is candidate experience. I've personally spoken to hundreds of talent leaders, and the one thing I always hear is that candidate experience is always one of, if not the most important thing that they care about. Joining us today are two people that know a ton about this topic. We have Amber Schwartz, Director of Talent at Salesloft, and Bryan Machado, Director of Recruiting at Pendo. Amber, Bryan, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's going to be a good session. So let's start with some intros. Please just introduce yourself, your role, and a little bit about your company. Let's start with Bryan.
Yeah, Director of Recruiting here at Pendo. Been here for about 3+ years. Pendo is a software company that enables companies to adapt to software easier.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bryan. And Amber?
Hi, Amber Schwartz here. I lead the global TA team at Salesloft, coming from Kennesaw, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. I've been with Salesloft for the last 4 years. And specifically, as we discussed Salesloft, we are the first AI-powered revenue orchestration platform. So we help companies specifically with their go-to-market teams, guiding them towards the right actions to yield the best outcomes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amber. Love Atlanta, by the way. And lastly, my name is Sean Huynh. I'm the host of this podcast. I'm from Rocket. We take a scientific approach to recruiting. We combine our talented recruiters with our AI model, which we've trained over the past 7 years, and some of our programmatic sourcing techniques. And it helps us find and engage candidates in ways that, for our clients, that are really impossible to do with LinkedIn. All right, so let's talk about candidate experience. Let's kind of start high level. Do each of you have like an overarching philosophy when it comes to candidate experience, in terms of like how you engage with candidates, how they engage with your brand? Is it something that is kind of instilled within your organization, or is it something that you've taken with you throughout your career? Just curious, like high level, your thoughts on this. Maybe we'll start with Amber.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think candidate experience actually starts with the ethos of the company and how they actually think about their talent. So talent, from my perspective, is the one unique thing for each company, right? We've seen a lot of like technology can be replicated. All of those things can be replicated, but it all goes back to how does your company view the talent and the people that work there? And so for us at Salesloft, we want anyone who applies at Salesloft, regardless of the outcome, to have a positive experience where their time and their energy that goes into the interview process is respected and they're kept up to date throughout the process. And really that approach stems from us wanting anyone who walks away from our process to be a promoter of Salesloft. We know that they talk to people in their networks, and they know a lot of different professionals. So even if they're not a fit for the role, or if the role wasn't a fit for them, we know that they'll go out and speak positively about Salesloft. And so our reputation is important. And also, I think the interview process for a lot of candidates is their only insight to what it might be like to be an employee of that company. So we keep all of those things sort of top of mind as we're thinking about candidate experience.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Maybe you won't be surprised, but we hear a lot of candidates that come to us and they'll tell us that they got a lot of red flags about the company through the interview process.
No.
They're like, there was just something off about it, or some of the questions that were asked, or how they were engaged, or how much like time was spent between like steps, and like, non-responsiveness. So it has a cascading effect if you have a bad candidate experience, for sure. Bryan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think both of you hit a lot of the key factors there on it, right? Candidate experience is really an extension of the culture as well as the talent brand of the company. And so like you mentioned, Sean, as soon as you come into the interview process and you're put off by something, you're really going to start wondering, okay, what is it actually like working there? Is this what it's like working there on a day-to-day basis? So it's really approaching it holistically, like Amber mentioned, where it's from start to finish, whether a person applies or you're passively sourcing them off LinkedIn or whatever platform you're using. you really need to set yourself up for success, because that's the real first entry into the company and what your culture, what your brand is, and what their overall experience is going to be, and carry that out throughout the whole interview process, whether it be through the recruiter screen, an initial interview with the business, on-site, virtual, on-site. I know we're kind of in that hybrid stage, and then even offer, and then into kind of their onboarding and bringing them into them, and really making sure that's a seamless process. And it's never really kind of skips a beat, so to say. When you're in said stage as a candidate, you're getting the same feel, you're over communicated to in a good way, not in like a very pestery way. And candidate experience these days, we've seen it here at Pendo, of where it's been the deciding factor of a candidate joining us or not joining us. And we've beat out some exceptional companies of individuals joining us just because of their experience through the interview process, and that permeating through their tenure here at Pendo, or whatever company you're coming from or going to. That helps that person set up for success. They know what they're getting into.
It's such an interesting topic. I'm glad you mentioned about even when you start, because I've heard a lot too. Like sometimes we'll reach out to a candidate who's maybe 2 months into a job, and they'll get back to us as recruiters and they'll say, I'm open. And we're like, wait a minute, you just started like 2 months ago. Why are you open? And they tell me about the bait and switch. They're like, you know what? Everything was great. The interview process, everyone was so friendly. And then when I joined, it was like a completely different company. And that's almost even more scary, because you've like uprooted yourself, you've left, and now you're at a company where it's like, this is nothing like I thought it was going to be. Right. So I think having that continuity of having a great candidate experience and even an onboarding experience is like super critical. Sorry, Amber, did you want to?
I was just going to add, I think to even take it a step further, I don't even think it stops at onboarding, right? So I think there has to be a through line and consistency across the entire employee life cycle. And that's something that's been a hot topic with our people leadership team, is how do we ensure that there's consistency from first impression through last impression, right? And whether that's going to another company and they're experiencing growth in that way, or they're progressing into a new role. So I love that that's kind of been brought up, because that's top of mind for us at Salesloft too.
Yeah, for sure. And even the unfortunate thing of layoffs, right? Like if you handle layoffs with grace and with compassion, and with like a human touch, I think it makes a huge difference than if you just like send a mass email and then like you no longer like have access to Slack, and then that's how you find out you're fired. Let's continue on the topic of culture and company values. Brian, you mentioned something about the pink glove experience on our pre-show call. Talk to us about the pink glove experience. I think, the people listening to this pod want to hear about it.
Yeah, I know we chatted about it last week. It's really handling people with care and intention. I know we also chatted about this. There's a book out there by Will Guidara about unreasonable hospitality. And you start thinking about that and you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? He's already a Michelin star, all that sort of stuff for 11 Madison Park. And anyone can serve you a meal, that's like black and white service, right? But when you start making it personal and intentional and actual care and meaning behind it, that's when you start getting color service. And it really kind of goes hand in hand with what we do here at Pendo with candidate experience and the pink glove that we brought up, is we're not really looking to just have a warm body in a seat. Right? We're looking to hire the right person for the right role at the right time. And that starts with that initial conversation with the candidate of what's your determining factors? What are you really looking to do? Where do you want to go? And where do you see yourself in a year to 3 to 5? Where do you see yourself in the future? And really making sure that aligns to what we're hiring to and what our mission is. And as soon as you start doing that, you start having that colored experience, right? You're making it personal, you're making it intentional, and that you're actually listening to them, right? A lot of times we know it if we're interviewing or we're talking to other people, you're like, okay, you clearly had no idea what I just said or what I'm actually looking for, because that's a square and I'm a circle, and I definitely don't fit in that hole over there. So you really try to make it personable, and that goes throughout the whole experience. Candidate experience isn't just about the candidate. It is really setting up the company for success as well. So making sure you have structured interview plans. So when a candidate comes in and interviews, they're not getting asked the same question by all 4 or 5 panel members, right? And you're really digging into the role and what we're hiring for. We joked about this, Sean, where we're not really interviewing to figure out how many golf balls fit in a bus. We're really looking to see if you could fit into Pendo a day in the life of the interview process. So when you're interviewing, it's almost simulating what you would have on a day-to-day basis and what you directly would be working on. And so once you set up the business side, the interviewers, the hiring managers for success, that only amplifies the candidate experience that they're coming into. And as we mentioned, the whole onboarding and kind of after the offer accept, so to say. And one thing that we do that I love is I lead the university recruiting program as well. And once we hire those folks, there's months before they start. So it's really getting them a newsletter, what features we've recently launched, meeting their mentor, meeting their manager, and physically inviting them and bringing them into our headquarter office out in Raleigh and having them do lunch with their potential manager, their mentor, all that sort of stuff. So once you start making it personable and making it an experience specifically for them, you've hit something really good, and that candidate experience only is going to be amplified after the fact.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Excuse me. So Amber, I want to ask from a Salesloft perspective. So you have Atlanta, you have London, Mexico, Boston. I think you just opened a center of excellence in Warsaw, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
So how do you maintain kind of that consistency? Like, obviously, tell us a little bit about kind of the culture at Salesloft, and then how do you create that consistent candidate experience across all the different offices and centers that you have?
Yeah. I think it actually goes back to a lot of what Bryan mentioned, right? Although we have offices spread across the globe, there's consistency in roles and in teams that are, even if a team may be based out of Poland, they are interfacing with teams in Guadalajara or in the US. And so I think it really goes back to, do we have the wider department aligned to a structured interview set? Do we understand what we're evaluating, not only from like a skills perspective, but also from how we see our culture or core values demonstrated in a day-to-day in the role that they hold. Now, because there are cultural differences when we talk about Guadalajara, Mexico, or Warsaw, Poland, or London, UK, with some of the locations in the US, we are mindful of that, and we make sure that we're addressing that with interviewers, specifically if they are located in a different location than where that role may be sitting. But we believe in culture carriers. So when we open a new office, we're really intentional about making sure that that site leader is ingrained in the culture at Salesloft and is able to sort of be the extension remotely. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So we are going through a period of change right now at Salesloft, or evolution, we'll call it that. We recently went through and acquired a company and are in the integration process. And as part of that, our ELT during annual planning kind of looked at how is our culture or values sort of evolving as we've come from a company that was at 100 people and 20 million, now a company that's 1,000 people, sort of marching towards that 400 million ARR mark. And there are points in our culture that have had to evolve based on where we're at now as a company. And so historically, we've had a core values interview team that was made up of individuals across all of our different locations. And we had a part of our interview process was 30 minutes with behavioral questions that tied back to our values. And again, it was, how do we see those demonstrated on a regular basis at Salesloft? And then how is there sort of connection between how a candidate views those and how they might demonstrate it. But as we're sort of evolving and changing to these new values, we've looked at, as opposed to putting that on one team of like 40 people, right, that are cycling in and out of interviews, how do we make sure that our core values are tied back to our interview process at every single step? So a hiring manager may cover one value or one element of that. Peers may cover another value or another element of our culture, just to make sure that the culture and our values are kind of tied throughout the entire process. And it really puts the ownership of assessing whether or not someone's a culture add to the entire team, as opposed to like just on these two individuals. And so I think those are a few ways that we've been able to make sure that as we grow and scale, we're remaining committed, and everything that we do is still aligned back to our overarching culture.
That's a really good point. And I think that like some of the stuff's a moving target, right? It changes. And I want to touch on that because you brought up an interesting point. Bryan, when you started at Pendo, I think there was about 300 people, and now you're just close to 800. So, you've also seen pretty explosive growth. I think it's like almost interesting. So like it's similar kind of growth trajectories for both companies. So have you noticed there been some maybe changes in the processes or how you interview candidates or how you kind of screen for like some of those cultural fit pieces?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's multiple facets of it, right? Where you're tasked with a high growth potential and high growth task to hire all these people into the company. And so when I came in to help build it on the kind of the EPD side, so engineering, product, and design side, it's creating a process that doesn't lose that candidate experience and doesn't affect our culture of hiring individuals into it. So how you do that is kind of like what Amber and I were saying, is structured interview plans. So how can you have repeatable, scalable, measurable hires that can come into the company and be effective and still have that culture add piece, so you're not affecting it? Because we all know if you hire 1 to 2 bad apples, so to say, you really could mess up the rest of the hires that you have, or mess up the process. So being able to scale that and have that into it, Amber mentioned it, of having like a culture add interviewer or having someone who's assessing culture during the interview. We do that, but it's also looked at throughout the whole interview process, right? If an engineer is doing a whiteboarding session and they notice something that's a complete red flag, by all means, they're bringing that up during a debrief session or providing that feedback to some magnitude. So it's calculated, right? You can't just expect the culture to carry on. I think if you have a culture of a company that was, 1 to 80, the culture is going to be a little bit different, but the core philosophies and the principles and the values of the company, you add into the interview process. You continue those core aspects of what you want from people throughout.
Mm-hmm. We hear a lot about companies so we speak to a lot of companies that have scaled like similar to what Salesloft and Pendo have seen. And what I hear most often is companies go from like a more of a generalist mindset to more of a specialist mindset as you get bigger and bigger. And I think it does change the way you interview. You have to adapt, right? Because if you don't, then your first 50 hires can't be the same as your hire number 700. Right. You gotta change your philosophy a little bit. Let's switch gears a little bit to tooling. Amber, I know when we talked, you mentioned something around Candidate FYI.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to share? Tell us about Candidate FYI. What is it? Why did you implement it? And how is it going?
Yeah. So we're early in stages of implementation soon, or currently. However, what led us to Candidate FYI, and the easiest way to describe what they do is, we're all familiar with Domino's Pizza Tracker. This is the Domino's Pizza Tracker for candidates. So it removes all the doubt that a candidate doesn't know where they stand in a process, right? I think we probably all experienced it or heard about it. You go into a process, they say they'll call you back for the next steps, but you're not really sure what the next steps are or how many next steps there are. And so that can start to feel like you're being dragged along, or the company doesn't understand what they're evaluating. So this gives candidates the insight to where they can see where they stand in an interview process. And then at each step of that interview process, they are given access to a portal, which is going to give them information about the company. It's going to give them information of how to prep for those specific interview steps, best practices, links, like information and bios about their interviewers. So it's, candidate experience. I think a big part of it is that human interaction with a recruiter, right? Building the relationship, building the trust. Goes back to everything Bryan said of really understanding what are the motivations of that candidate and making sure that there's like understanding there. But also we need to be mindful of like the scalability of that, right? As companies and hiring demands have shifted and changed, a lot of recruiting teams have contracted in size. So they may have been working 5 roles, which maybe is 50 candidates a few years ago, and now they're working 10 roles and 100 candidates at one time. So how can we make sure that we're providing that level of one-to-one relationship building, but that candidates also have a self-service way to be able to log into this portal? Maybe it's 10 p.m. at night before their interview or 7 a.m. they're a morning person, and get all of that information and have it available to them at their fingertips. And they've got the portal. We'll run all of our scheduling through them as well. But also we'll be using their tool for pulse checks. So candidate surveys historically have been a way that companies have assessed like their interview process or their candidate experience. But more often than not, companies put that in at the end of the process. So once a decision is made, they're either hired or we're not moving forward, or the candidate has pulled themselves out, and now we're asking them to go back and rate their entire experience. What pulse surveys allow for is after every interview to do like a quick scale of 1 to 5. How did you feel that interview went? Or like, what feedback do you have for us? And then in real time, we'll be able to adjust and assess, like, we've seen consistent feedback that this stage of our interview, like candidates are not having a great experience, or they don't feel prepared, or this interviewer, right, is causing some challenges in our process. How do we like get with them on one-to-one coaching to make sure that we're addressing those concerns in real time? So yeah, we're still early on, but we're really excited to be able to offer this to candidates and to start getting some feedback from candidates on what they think about it, because I think it's certainly unique and not common right now.
Interesting. Well, maybe we'll have to do a follow-up episode where you tell us how it went. Bryan, what about at Pendo? Are there any tools, processes, things that you're doing to ensure A, you're getting feedback from the candidates, and B, that candidates are aware of like where they are in the process and what happens next?
Yeah, overall, I think it's kind of funny that ATSs are built for a black hole for candidates. There is no actual like candidate portal on most ATSs for them to realize where they're at in the process. So that's a pretty cool tool to hear about. Yeah, we use technologies as well. One of our recruiters was actually recognized recently by Calendly and Greenhouse for his use of the tools to ensure candidates are having a great experience. And then for where candidates are in the process, we don't have any technology that like Amber was mentioning about. But like Amber mentioned, and I did earlier, it's over communication, making sure candidates know exactly where in the process, what they can expect, being direct and transparent about where they're at and what to expect and how to prepare for interviews goes a long way, which is a crucial piece to the interview process. And then we do surveys as well to candidates at the end of their time, whether they are hired or not, as long as they came into the interview process itself. We want to learn, because like Amber mentioned, if you're not learning and evolving from that, you're just going to fall behind, or you're going to create bad habits, bad candidate experience. And we take it a step further too, where we start looking at exit surveys as well. What was their experience? Why didn't it work? If for some reason, say a candidate didn't perform well as an engineer, we're going to go back and start looking at the interview feedback. Were there signs that maybe we missed? Should we, like you mentioned, Sean, of companies evolving, you have to start interviewing like we did. You're not interviewing for a generalist engineer, so to say. You're starting to focus in on front end. You're starting to focus on back end. the hot topic right now, right? AI, machine learning. So do we need to evolve our interview process because we're starting to see individuals not perform when they actually do come into the company? So really having that life cycle of involvement from post being hired or interviewing, and then all the way to when someone leaves the company, start marrying that data together, because you have to evolve through it, because things will change. We all know in this space, every day is not the same. It's going to change, and there's going to be new aspects that we either need to evaluate or prepare ourselves for.
That's great feedback. Okay, so there's 2 points that I'm just going to put it out there in case I forget, because sometimes I go blank on these things. One is the interview process length. I want to talk about that for a second, because we get a lot of feedback from candidates on that from companies. And see, I knew this was going to happen. I knew I was going to draw a blank. So there was that. And then the second one was interview process length. Okay, candidates that get rejected. There we go. Okay,
Yeah.
So I want to ask about, because this is a delicate topic. When a candidate gets rejected, you're going to get some feedback from the hiring manager, and it could be for whatever reason. We have heard some of the craziest reasons as an agency. Like, I ran an agency for 4 years prior to Rocket, and like, I've heard everything from, you don't even want to know the kind of feedback I've heard of why candidates.
Probably shouldn't mention it on air.
I will not mention it. I will not name names, but I've heard some wild feedback on why people haven't been hired, even at the final stage. Like, they passed all technical interviews, everything, and they're right at like the final like culture fit interview. It should be like a done deal, and then they got rejected for some crazy reason. Do you always try to be as transparent as possible with the candidate, or are there times where you just can't provide that feedback because maybe it's kind of off, And I think we all know what we're talking about. Let's go with Amber. What are your thoughts on this? Like, how transparent should you be with? Sorry?
So I'm excited to be in the hot seat first on this topic. Yeah. I think it's, to your point, it's an extremely delicate scenario. I mean, it's an extremely delicate situation, right? Because I think anytime there are a lot of legalities that come into that, right? And more often than not, and I see and hear and understand the perspective of candidates. And then there's also this element of wanting to make sure that, you're protecting yourself as a company, which I think more often than not, the route that companies choose to go is like, we're not going to be able to provide specific feedback. And that is, more often than not, that's where you start to see, like, we decided to go with another candidate who is a better fit for our current needs. And so I think that there's sort of a mixture of both that we do at Salesloft, right? Like, where we have specific feedback that's going to be able to constructive, that's going to be able to help that candidate. Let's say, like, a perfect example where we see constructive feedback coming into play is when we ask a candidate to do a mock discovery call for our SDR teams, right? And this kind of goes back to candidate experience and prepping as well. We're clear with candidates that as part of that mock discovery, there will be a portion of that that's feedback, where the manager is going to live give you feedback, allow you to also like self-assess like how you did, what areas you have. And more often than not, we're going to allow you to redo that and see how you apply that feedback, right? When you start to get into like when you start to get in later stages of a process, it's very rare that only one candidate, right, is at that stage.
Yeah.
So the company ultimately has to make a decision as to which candidate is right for us today and fits our needs, and do we feel most confident with moving forward with. I've seen plenty of scenarios where we have two excellent candidates, and it really comes down to one small thing, right? That, was assessed during our process that this person maybe got a strong yes on, and the other candidate got a yes. And so again, I think when you start to hear the crazy feedback and the crazy reasons, that also could go back to, are you enabling and training your interview teams to make sure that you are, that they know what their role is as an interviewer, what they're assessing and what they're not assessing? Because I think, again, that crazy feedback is typically something that comes from like inexperienced interviewers that there's no standard for like what they should be assessing is when you start to get into some of the crazy stuff. But that's my take, Brian.
That was a good answer.
Yeah,
that was a good answer, Brian. You're up. You're in the hot seat now.
It's a delicate art, right? Amber mentioned that out the gate, and it does go back to having a structured interview plan and knowing exactly what you're assessing and being able to provide that feedback. The delicate balance is really being as direct and transparent as you can, because you want to help these individuals, especially this day and age. There's a lot of individuals who have been out of jobs for a long time or recently laid off and need to make sure that they can survive. But also balancing that you don't want to give away the person who actually gave the negative feedback, or maybe not, negative is not the right word. Maybe it's that they're not at the bar of what we need, and really making sure that you're protecting the kind of backside of the house as well, of individuals not going directly after one of our interviewers. I've also had it where hiring managers felt completely comfortable being direct and transparent with the individual, where they had every aspect we were looking for, but their coding in a certain section wasn't at the level that we actually needed, and talked with the person directly and said, hey, take these courses, take these online classes, get back to us in 6 months and let's interview you again and see where you're at. So I've had success stories like that too. So it's really in kind of feeling out where the candidate is and how receptive they would be to that, and ensuring that you're doing it in a constructive manner, not in like a negative tone that would put someone off, because again, it's a continuation of the candidate experience. And you want to be able to do that. And Sean, I know you and I kind of joked about this when we talked, but one of my favorite sayings is the candidate that we didn't hire is the best hire we made, because that person had the great experience. They're going to go out and tell all their network that you need to go interview with this company I just did, because it was the best interview process. And it kind of goes to what we were talking about of having the conversation of providing feedback, and those individuals who are receptive to it and that know how to take it are like, this company is going above and beyond, and they're actually being direct, transparent, and helping me in my search and my next step. You should go try to interview with them, because I know you'd be a great fit there. So it's really an art to be able to figure out.
Yeah, this is such an interesting topic. I don't know how we got here, but I'm glad we got here. It's people, right? And sometimes it just comes down to, I just didn't, like, we weren't able to like communicate amazing, and we just didn't feel like it was gelling, you know? And I know it's hard feedback. Like, how do you say to someone like, I don't know, you just didn't gel with the manager? I mean, maybe you could say that to them and maybe they would agree. But in some cases, like, does that matter? Right? Like, at the end of the day, if you're hiring someone to do a job, I guess it does, right? Because you have to be able to do the job effectively, but within the confines of like the corporate or organizational structure. And if like that organization needs to be like a well-oiled machine to be successful. So you can't take the human element out of it, or else you just would just test and you wouldn't even talk to these people. And then you hired people that would get the highest scores. Right.
Sorry, when Brian was speaking, I thought of two things that kind of highlight what he said. And it goes back to the people element, right? I think to your point, I think not gelling with a manager may not be constructive, right? But that lends itself to, if we have this role available, like you've received positive feedback throughout the process, we'd love to re-engage with you, right? But I think that also could be tied back to culture and values to begin with. But I think the two other things when it comes to delivering feedback is it's rare that companies and interviewers acknowledge the time and effort the candidates spend in the process. So even just acknowledging that as part of, hey, you know, I'm giving you a call because we decided to select another candidate, but I want to be clear that I understand how much effort you put into this process, and we genuinely appreciate that, right? And so it's we ask that candidates send thank you notes after interviews all the time, and it's like a expectation of managers. But how often is a manager taking the time to then say, like, thank you for your time, like we really enjoyed meeting you? But then I think the second piece to feedback is, how are you giving it, right? So are you calling and delivering that message? Are you sending an email to that candidate? Is your email thoughtful, or is it standard out of the box? And so, so I think those are important points. And then the last thing on feedback is you were starting to get to this, but the individual has to be open and ready to receive that feedback. Mm-hmm. And so, leading when you're letting a candidate know that they didn't receive a job, there will be candidates that say, like, can you tell me more? Like, I'm really open to feedback. But there are other candidates who need time and space to process and maybe aren't going to ask for it there. And so we also welcome the opportunity of, I'm going to send you an email after this, understand that this is a lot of information at once, or that you need to process. Like, please feel free to reach back out to me at a later date if you want like more detailed feedback, or if you want to discuss like a certain step or feedback that we received during the process.
Yeah, it's so true. Not every candidate's the same, right? Some candidates really, they crave that feedback. They want to know because they're walking to another interview tomorrow and they want to get better. But some others they'd rather just Control Alt Delete, forget it ever happened, and just move on, right? Am I aging myself with that? I don't know. Does anyone know what Control Alt Delete? No? Okay. I don't think anyone uses PCs anymore. I mean, I haven't used one in like 15 years. Okay. So this is the last question before we wrap up. We're talking, Amber, you mentioned like length. And so I'm just curious because some clients that we have are very much like, hey, we want to get the interview process done. And I'm not talking like a super like, C-level executive hire. Like we're talking, anywhere from like an associate to like maybe senior manager, kind of director level in there. Is there like a time frame that you try to get your candidates through the process so that, within like X number of weeks, they kind of have a decision or does that vary per role? I'm just curious if you have like any like organizational policies around that or like philosophies around that. Maybe we'll start with Bryan.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it kind of goes with the communication too, right? So setting the expectation of what to expect of the interview process. And it all depends upon the role, like you mentioned, Sean. If it's like an associate, then you more than likely have a continuous pipeline that's going for that in some nature. And those process will probably go a little bit quicker than others. Same as like evergreen roles that individuals have open. So let's say like AEs, for example, there's always going to be AE evergreen role that's always open. So that's going to come in a timely manner. And then it also depends too, if it's a new role in general for the company. Like a lot of companies are going into the AI ML space, super hot topic, super hot market. So that's probably going to take a little bit longer to get the individual into the process, through the process, and probably going against 8 other offers to try to negotiate with and get that person into the company. So for us, we do have some SLAs, but it goes back to what I said earlier. It's hiring the right person at the right time for the right role. And so if that's happens in a week or 2 weeks, amazing. If that happens in 3 to 4 weeks, if we got the right person, perfect. Because if you get that hire wrong, you're only going to make things worse and harder and longer in your return on investment throughout that. So I think again, another delicate balance of timely manner as well as the right time for the right role with the right person.
I love that. Amber, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it also all goes back to structured interview processes and being able to use your process as the sort of pushback to how many steps do you need. Kind of starts with like, what are we evaluating? What are those competencies or skills? How are we evaluating them and in what steps? And as long as, right, it doesn't matter how many steps it is, because depending upon the role, maybe you need 6 interviews across, 3 weeks to be able to assess all of the competencies that are tied back to that role. Maybe you only need 3 steps because, to Bryan's point, it's an associate level role. You don't have a long history of work experience that you're evaluating against. But our gauge is always, what are we hoping to gain out of adding a step? And is there another way that we can think about assessing that, or can we add that into another interview? So like, that's kind of all the gauges. are we assessing something new? And is it tied back to the competencies that we aligned to at the beginning of the process? And then the second piece is just the transparency. I don't think candidates really care if they're going through 2 steps or 10 steps if ultimately their goal is to be with a company long term and they want to ensure that, right, interviewing is a two-way process. So they are interviewing the company just as much as we are interviewing them. So as long as you're transparent with what they can expect, and they know like what we're looking to cover during each step, and we're giving them the opportunity to interview us as well, then of course there are, to Brian's point, like we have SLAs internally for different things, but that fluctuates between role and different candidates, so sort of like where they're at as well.
Amber mentioned something there that I think a lot of people don't hit on, that we hit on very heavily, is candidates. We're interviewing candidates, but they're interviewing us just as much this day and age. There's a lot of opportunities out there. There's a lot of choices. So being able to give them time to ask actual questions that they want answers to for their own kind of evaluation of you as a company, I think is crucial, and a lot of people don't do. And to be able to do that, I think only helps elevate your candidate experience.
And that's the mic drop. With that, thank you, Brian and Amber. We're out of time. I appreciate both of you. This is a great episode. I think I learned a lot. Hopefully each of you did as well. And for everyone tuning in, thanks so much for checking out Recruiting Roundtable. Until next time, happy hunting. Thanks, everyone.